What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name's Ethan.
And my name is Derry.
And today we are going to do a long overdue response to the docu-series called Hillsong, a Megachurch Exposed. This documentary came out, I don't know, a number of months ago. We should have done this right when it came out. It would have been way more trendy, but it's all right.
Still
Better
important.
late than never. Still important.
Yeah, still important. Yeah,
But
but it's gonna be a good one. I really enjoyed the series, so I'm excited to get into it. I think there's so many good subtopics and problems to talk about within this that it doesn't really matter that we're covering it late. Everybody has an opinion about the church, I think, and I think this will kind of be less about like the church as a whole, and at least from my perspective, and a lot about like how do you deal with some of the problems and prevent them from happening in like future churches, and what does the model of the church have to look like, and how does outside criticism play into it and stuff like that. That'll be good.
Yeah, definitely. So we're gonna get into it. I got a number of points written down. Darius got points we want to talk about. Like you said, I think that one of the biggest things for me, at least watching this series, before we get into it, is kind of like, what do we do with this information? I don't remember. Maybe they did. I finished the series earlier today. Watched the rest of it yesterday, but I don't think I heard a lot about like the solution to the problem, which maybe that wasn't their goal. Maybe their goal was just to present the facts of what happened without presenting any type of solution, which, I mean, that's journalism, it's fine.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, so that's something I'd like to get into towards the end is like, where do we go from here? What do we do with this? Mindsets to have. That's kind of like one of the bigger things. But this along with like, what's that?
That'd be a great thing to answer, I think.
Yeah. And so with this docu-series, so what it is basically Hillsong, if you are in the charismatic tradition, I don't like calling it tradition because it's too new to be a tradition. If you're in the charismatic stream, you know about Hillsong. If you go to church at all, you probably have sang their songs at least once. They make like the most,
at least non-noms.
Yeah, non-noms. Yeah. If you don't sing hymns, you probably have Hillsong or Bethel. Maybe some Ren Collective in there, but
Maverick
you
City.
got what's that? Oh, Mavericks. Now it's Maverick City. Yeah.
Now they're hot. Waiting for that documentary soon.
Oh, and I was just gonna say, make a joke. Hopefully not. Hopefully they can be pure.
Lord, please.
Right. But
there'll be a doc soon, I'm sure.
Yeah. This docu-series is, like I said, a journalistic approach to Hillsong and like the problems in it, which it definitely does have problems. And you have a church that spans the like a number of countries and has 150,000 people weekly around the world. That's like, you're going to have a lot of problems with a lot of people. But this was mainly focusing on core leadership problems and faulty things within the church structure that led to spiritual abuse. And one of the pastors, Carl Lentz, this is very public knowledge, being fired from Hillsong because he ended up cheating on his wife.
You're spreading gossip right now.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so the whole second episode was about Carl Lentz and his whole situation, which they actually brought on the girl that he was like sleeping with, and she told her story, and it was like crazy because I was like, I did not expect that. I thought they'd like, and so it was really enlightening, really made me upset about a lot of things because I just get so sad when this happens in the church, and it happens like the Big C church, right? Happens too often. We had Ravi Zacharias a number of years ago. Now this and Carl Lentz.
Different, but
yeah, problems in big church leadership. You had like Mark Driscoll, stuff like that. And the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. That's a good podcast. Just gets me really sad and upset because I know that like for all the attention put on the bad of the church that happens in the celebrity pastor realm and that whole culture, and we can talk about that, there's like probably even more good happening in like local church congregations that no one knows about.
Right. Yeah, that made me the most sad part of like the whole the whole documentary is like you get to see firsthand how the church, like mega churches, can hurt people, and church abuse in general, how it can hurt people, how those power structures can be abused. And it just sucks because you think like, man, if you didn't go to that church and you went to a different one, you could find so much peace, and you can find so much like
Mm-hmm.
fulfillment and so much good connection to God and communities that love him. But like, because you went to this one, like, how hard is it going to be for anybody in that position to trust a church again? Like, it's going to be a long process if they ever even get back to it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It just sucks to think about.
Yeah, one of the main girls that they had on talking about it actually used to be a member of there, and now she's not even a Christian. She
Right.
claims to be an atheist, which is like really sad. Um, and just like, well, we also don't know why she's an atheist. You know, maybe she had her own reasons outside of the
Right.
church problems, and I'm sure that played into it. But yeah, with that though, what that does show is, I think, and this is the true of anyone, any background. Me and Derek were just talking about this before. Whoever makes a series has a bias that they're coming at the series with, you know. And so we don't
Yeah.
know if this was made by Christians to talk about, hey, this in-house problem, let's fix it, or if it was
Mm.
made by someone who is hurt by the church and wants to expose them out of anger. We don't know. All we know is that like
Yeah.
there's a problem and they wanted to talk about it. And I think they did a pretty good job of being as just factual about what happened as possible. But there were
Yeah.
also a lot of claims out there that were like, yeah, a lot of claims by people who used to be part of it
Mm.
about like Hillsong's not a church, it's a brand. They don't care about people, they care about the brand, which
Yeah.
they did support with a lot of evidence based on like, yeah, you can tell they don't care about people by XYZ and they care more about the
Mm.
brand by XYZ. So I think overall it was an informative and well put together, and I would say engaging series that I would feel comfortable having people still watch, so long
Yeah.
as they understand that this is not all of Christianity. This is Hillsong, which I think they did. They did
Right.
talk about that, which I liked.
Right. I think from a producer's standpoint, it's pretty clear the person that made it isn't a Christian. Maybe they just, the person who directed the first episode, but the person that made the first episode just doesn't have any knowledge of like Christian culture, like whatsoever. Because like one of their biggest critiques, because the first episode's like about the inception kind of Hillsong and the setting up of some of the
Mm-hmm.
bad structures. Second episode's about Carl Lentz mostly, and the last episode's kind of like Brian Houston and more like sexual abuse, sexual assault kind of allegations and stuff, money
Mm-hmm.
things. And then all of that's kind of weaving through there a little bit, but those are kind of the main themes. In the first episode, they're like, Hillsong moved to New York because there's no Christians there, and they wanted to get the people who don't believe in God and are sinners to come to the church. And you're like, well, yeah, that's the goal of the church in general.
Yeah,
like you're
yeah.
saying that like it's an abusive and like manipulative thing. Like they were saying, like Hillsong, when he was talking about Brian Houston in his early days, he was like, Brian Houston had global aspirations and he wanted to take the church global and wanted people around the world to hear the gospel. And you're like, yeah, that's what all of us want, actually. Like,
That's what
I don't
Christians
know.
want.
I don't know if you have talked to Christians before, but like we want everybody to also be Christians. Like that's
Yeah.
what we think the world should be. And it just, you could tell there was some, if you're not a part of Christianity, it can seem a little strange. And so they kind of played it in an abusive or manipulative kind of scheme instead of
Mm-hmm.
kind of understanding it in the context of like Christianity in itself. So I thought the first episode had a lot of really bad points, but
Mm-hmm.
overall I thought the show was really good in general. But you could tell it wasn't from like someone who understood Christianity very well, because they got a lot of, at least that kind of Christianity, because they got a lot of things, or they interpreted things a little bit wrong. Yeah.
Right. One thing that so I think maybe they went into this a little bit in the third episode, but not in depth to the degree that they should have, I think. But because one of the people they had on, they said, and this is like a general paraphrase, they said they manipulate you into being okay with the abuse they throw at you, which is like basically this old attendant was saying like, hey, like I went there and they try to brainwash and manipulate you into being okay with the abuse you're going through as if like it's normal and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then from there, I was waiting like the whole episode. I was like, this is like a few minutes into the first episode. I was like, all right, are you going to go into that? Are you going to, I want, like, at the very least, I'd like a story of how you saw this play out. Like, I'd like to see this in real, and like when people make claims, that needs evidence to be supported, right? So I was kind of waiting for that. It never really came. That's not to say the abuse didn't happen. They did talk about that a little bit, which I did appreciate. Like the idea about like if you question things that they would kind of make you feel like the bad guy, and like serious things, right? That's definitely a problem. But that was said by someone who was not the person who made the claim. That was a separate story. So yeah, I just wish they would have kind of went into that a little bit more. Like if you're gonna make a claim like the church is this, well,
Mhm.
show me the church is that. Show me, bring more people to support that.
Yeah. What was the exact thing they said again? Can you remind me?
It went along the lines of they manipulate you into being okay with the abuse that they throw at you or put you through.
Hmm. It seemed to me like the examples they gave of the abuse was much more of, I mean, yeah, I think maybe they could have done that, but it seemed much more of like they're just trying to cover it up rather than making the people that were abused feel okay with it. But I'm sure that could be a byproduct of it. I don't think they just didn't show that a lot, maybe because they didn't have direct quotes that they could like tell you about how they tried to silence those people, because it was clear
Mm-hmm.
that they were trying to save themselves and make things look okay and like pull
Oh
PR
yeah,
stunts and stuff
absolutely.
like that. And like
Yeah.
they showed you a lot of the ways that the church tried to cover up on their tracks, and so maybe they just kind of left that part of how they spoke to the abused unsaid, I guess. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting. I didn't make that connection. That's good.
Yeah. Well, I was just like kind of waiting. I was like, come on, I want to hear. But then by the third episode, one woman did talk about how um, something happened and she was like sexually assaulted by one of the
Mm,
members and he wasn't
right,
tried and they tried to
right,
make her feel bad and it was a really big deal. That's totally unacceptable.
right.
Like
Yeah,
that. I think that guy even got a light punishment for
yeah. I definitely did.
legally. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what part do you want to go into first in this whole topic? Do you want to talk about the church or the leaders that did abuse or the people that made the documentary? Where do you want to go into first?
I feel like we covered as much as I feel comfortable covering like with what we covered about the people who made it. You know, they have a bias that
Yeah.
they're probably showing. Just like if a Christian made a bias, maybe their bias would be like to say like, "Hey, this happened. We're not trying to make excuses, but we also want to show the truth of the
Mm,
gospel." Right?
yeah.
That'd probably be a more Christian take. It's just like the
Right.
American gospel, how it was made by cessationists who don't believe in miracles.
Mhm,
So if you believe in miracles, they might classify you as like a heretic. So
mhm,
when you're watching that, like the American Gospel is another documentary, but made by Christians about the Apostolic Reformation that's happening,
right.
which is part of Hillsong. Hillsong's part of it. Um, and so you got to realize like, oh, they think miracles are bad. If you do miracles, you might be aligned with what they would call bad. You just got to understand the biases of the things that you're watching.
Right. Right.
Watch it with a clear head.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I'm fine with us talking about like interesting points that we talked about it, or we or interesting points that they made that we thought about while watching it individually, and then we can
Mhm.
get into more general stuff if you want to.
Yeah, definitely. Let's do it. Cool.
Yeah, one of the things that they talked about, which I wanted to just clarify, at least my opinion on, they talked about
Mhm.
how this Pentecostal movement started in the 70s and
Oh
became
yeah.
like this fast growing thing. I think that frames the Pentecostal like
It
more
is so much
Pentecostal.
generalizing.
Yeah, right. So
Yeah.
Pentecostal refers to like this word called Pentecost, which is when the Spirit fell on like the disciples in the Bible in Acts. Like
Mhm.
Pentecost happened in Acts. Actually, this last Sunday was Pentecost.
Pentecost Sunday.
Yeah.
Not
So
for you guys, but for us.
what do you mean?
Like not for the people listening, but for us it was.
Oh yeah, yeah, for
Yeah,
Christians.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, not for
Um,
Christians, for
what do you
people
mean?
listening. Because they're listening to this like in a couple weeks.
Oh, I see. I thought you were saying like, oh, non-Christians are going to listen to this, so it's going to for
No, no,
them. I
no,
was
no.
like, I guess you
Sorry.
could say they don't get to partake in it. Yeah, this is coming out weeks
You
after.
guys can't be a part of Pentecost.
You want to celebrate Pentecost? Okay. Have you been bathed in the blood? I don't know if I want to
Didn't think so.
Yeah. So by the time we're recording this, Pentecost was last Sunday. You can
Yeah.
figure out when we recorded it. And so Pentecostal, is kind of like another word for charismatic, where they believe in the Spirit, they believe in speaking in tongues, they believe in healings and prophesying. And in what America has witnessed, it has probably had a bad flavor, just due to it seems very hype and it can be unorganized. And so this idea that Pentecostalism started in the 70s, I don't think is accurate due to the
Hmm.
fact that it's called Pentecostal. You know, it started with
Mhm.
Acts. It was things like this happened in the book of Acts. Now the cultural idea of Pentecostals definitely probably more in the 70s and whatnot and up until now. But I would say if you believe in the miracles still happening, you can and gifts of the
Mhm.
Spirit, you're a light Pentecostal. Like you might not know it,
Right.
but
Yeah, I
yeah.
think you have to kind of deviate the theology a little bit to make points like that. Because yeah, like the Pentecostal movement as like a movement did start in the 70s or like the late 19th century or 1900s. Wow, I can't speak today. But yeah, for like the theology, like Catholics, Orthodox Christians believe that miracles happen and, you know, believe in the gifts of the Spirit and stuff like that to different varying degrees. So yeah, there was a lot of generalizing there that I didn't think was healthy, but was very normal for like non-Christians making a documentary.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like, I just don't want anyone walking away being like, "Oh, all Pentecostals are bad because Hillsong came from Pentecostals." It's like,
Right.
well, you know, so did a lot of good things.
Right.
You know.
Right.
I don't know if you guys can hear my cat's meowing behind that door. I don't know what she wants, but she's saying hi. If you can hear her.
So, from your opinion, do you think that which was a bigger deal? Do you think like the Lentz situation was a bigger deal, or do you think like the Hillsong as a church, as an organization, was a bigger like moral deal in this documentary? Not like how they portray it, but like in actuality.
In actuality, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting because I don't want to say Hillsong stamp all of Hillsong everything as bad because there's clear things that are good about it.
Oh
right?
yeah, definitely.
So it's not that easy. So for instance, and this is like this is the thing. There's ways to do all of what they were doing without doing it how they did, right? The reason everyone's mad about what happened is because they called themselves a church when everyone who experienced them, at least that they interviewed, called it more of a brand. They're like, oh, there's a Hillsong brand. They're trying to protect the brand. Now, if Hillsong would have broken up and had like Hillsong Records and Hillsong Records produced all the music and you had things happen there, that makes more sense because it's like, oh yeah, that's a music brand. That's a like a record label that is under like maybe Hillsong, but it's its own entity, right? And if you had like Hillsong merch and whatnot, but when you do get to the church stuff and you do have the brand stuff, it's a problem. But I don't know if I would say the problem is Hillsong and the way they do it. I think the problem is like mega churches in general, because this isn't an isolated incident that's just with Hillsong. We saw this with like Mark Driscoll had moral failure, not sexual immorality, but he had moral failure where he had like verbal abuse in and he had to be let go, right? You have other things happen with that, with people who have mega churches become celebrity pastors, get isolated, and then there's failure, right? So the problem isn't necessarily, in my opinion, like all of Hillsong, because like
the type of system you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a system in which they were able to grow. You know, it's a bigger deal than that. But because the thing is, like a lot of their worship, and this is something we could talk about too, and we have a little bit in the past couple weeks, their worship was considered to be manipulative and kind of hypnotic and stuff like that. But their worship, if you look at their lyrics, like if you just listen to a lot of their lyrics in the worship songs, are really good, biblically accurate, theologically accurate songs. I'm like, I can worship to God to this and have no problems. So I have a hard time saying like the Hillsong as a whole is wrong. Carl Lentz definitely probably was the domino that tipped everything that all this stuff came out. Let's like, you know, open a bag of worms. Like he's the first worm that got out, right? And so I think that is the Carl Lentz situation seems to be informative of a faulty system at large. You know, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's so hard to say because Carl was and also Brian were both kind of viewed as like narcissists and sort of played in that light for most of the episode. And it's so hard to say from our perspective whether they are or not, because we don't know them, we don't know their minds and their intents. It's clear that they are good at manipulating human beings, right? It's good. It's obvious they're communicators. They're like very intelligent. They're charismatic people. So it's easy to get people to follow them. What is really hard to say is like, was Carl fake from the beginning? And like, was he abusing his whole way through? Because it seemed like he had a lot of moral failures from the beginning till the end, or at least that's how they painted it a little bit, right? That's what like a lot of the evidence kind of showed. Was that the case, that this was just a bad guy in also maybe a bad system? Or was he like a bad guy that became a Christian and was changed and then genuinely loved the Lord, but because of this faulty system was elevated beyond natural status and given power that would corrupt anybody and then fell because of that power, right? I'm not necessarily sure. I would say he probably was the former of, I think he is a Christian, but he is an abuser, and it seems like he had a pattern of abuse throughout
Mm-hmm.
the whole, like his whole time, both with Wave Church and then on to Hillsong.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like, whenever you have like a relationship with somebody like he did for a long period of time, and it's not like a one-time moral failure, like that shows like a character of you're okay with like keeping a secret, and you're okay of like with lying to people for a long period of time
Yeah.
and keeping
Yeah.
something from your wife, and like you're okay spending time with the Lord and prepping a sermon for a Sunday. Like you got to spend a lot of time with the Lord prepping a sermon for a Sunday, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're okay spending that time and having this unrepentant sin that you're going to go back to, right? And so
Right.
I think that shows a lot of his character. I would say he was probably an abusive kind of person and had abused before he was put in these situations, and that just made him even more abusive by like entering this system. But I would say that the system itself is more problematic just than just Carl.
Mm-hmm.
Was I saying Brian the whole time? I don't know.
No, no,
Than
you weren't.
just Carl, but definitely Carl, like not a great guy. I hope like he repents of everything going on, um, and like genuinely comes to know the Lord, maybe for the first time, maybe back again. Who knows? Like who's to say in that situation?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but I would say the system itself is the more problematic thing in my mind. And Carl is a person that is an abuser that abuse the system and abuse people, and probably will continue when given power, unless he like finds help or the Lord changes his heart.
Right. And on that topic, right? Like I think there's a saying out there that says like power just reveals what's already there. Like power
Mm-hmm.
doesn't you don't like get power and influence and authority and then suddenly have this sin issue that you never had before, right? You probably maybe not maybe there's a few instances where that happens,
Mm-hmm.
but you probably had a root of that sin issue that was tiny and small and festered, but as you grew, sort of that problem. And what they talked about is that he got isolated, and that's a common
Yeah,
theme that that common theme is with like every time there's a moral failure with an important leader, 9 times out of 10, from what I've looked at and what I've heard, people said like they isolated themselves. They weren't getting
yeah,
accountability. There wasn't people there challenging him, calling him higher. And that's the thing, like he was in a system which permitted this to grow, right? Like you said, he had this history of inappropriate behavior around women. He had this history, and he talked about that even before he was a Christian as part of his testimony. So
right,
it followed him from before he was a Christian. And
right,
um, and with that being said, it's like the system took this person who had this sin problem and elevated them to a position where they were the star, all eyes were on him, everyone wanted it. I'm sure he probably is a narcissist. Like I just think every human has a tendency to narcissism and has narcissistic parts of them. Every human has that little bit of them that like is a narcissist and wants the best for just you, and like that's part of the sin and sinful flesh that we have to put away. But it's like it can be part of the things that we struggle through as Christians. Um, and so I think a lot of people experience that type of stuff. So I am not surprised if he's a narcissist. And if you look at and study what like narcissistic behaviors are and what he like had, I would say I wouldn't be surprised if they were aligned. I haven't done that, but I wouldn't be surprised. One thing you said that I want to talk about is that you said but you touched on how he had this ongoing sinful, unrepentant relationship
mm-hmm.
while he's prepping sermons. And I talked to my mom about that like exact thing yesterday. We were watching it, and it just like it makes me so sad and like angry because I'm like, how can you honestly be in the presence of the Lord and trying to write a sermon that you're going to share with a lot of people, knowing you have this unrepentant part, and how does it not eat you up to the point of repentance? Like I
Yeah,
remember, like even before I wasn't even like I was not on staff anywhere. I was
mm-hmm.
like I am with our with YWAM. I wasn't like in YWAM. I wasn't. I was just attending a church as a volunteer, and I remember I had this. I made a bad mistake with this girl, and my dad asked me about it, and I lied to my dad about it, and I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't even in a position of authority. And like for 3 weeks until I confessed to my dad, it like I was miserable and it ate me up inside, and I felt like throwing up every time I would try. Like I would try to like worship or do anything, and like I try to like justify and all these different things, try to do quiet times, and it just like it was like a salt in a wound and something poking it every time, and could not get away from it. I was just eaten up with conviction because I sinned, and I was like, how? So I see that, and I know like small is like quote unquote small thing I went through was so devastating spiritually. Like I was just like, I never want to feel this way again. And it
Right.
just makes me so sad that he was able to be in that position and not seem like he cared. And the only reason that he stopped it is because he got caught. It wasn't a repentant, like, hey, I need to come clean about this. He's like, yo, everything got found out. We had to stop. And so
Yeah.
I have a hard time. Like, I don't want to stamp if he's a Christian or not. I just have a really hard time saying he's a Christian because I'm just like, I
Yeah.
just can't believe that someone who's truly filled with the Holy Spirit and loves the Lord is okay and permitting this sin, and not
Right.
not just any Christian, a leader, a Christian leader, a new
Yeah.
Christian that would be more permissible. Someone who's been
Yeah.
following the Lord for and working through a lot of things, and there's like these steps. Like I'm not worried about the person who just became a Christian last year and there's still some sin issues that they haven't confronted. I'm
Mhm.
talking about like when you're a leader. You know, the Bible says in James that if you long to teach, like be afraid because you are held to a higher standard. You
Mhm.
know, God holds them to such a high standard. If you're going to preach the word of God to people and be a spiritual leader, there's a huge standard that God holds against you to do that. And it's a scary thing. And to be so okay with just like this, whatever, like I'm fine, like I'm never gonna get found out. It's just like it's obviously you
Mhm.
can tell I'm upset about it, but I just like
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
Yeah. No, that's true. It's definitely a hard situation, and I I genuinely want to believe that at one point he was did genuinely follow Christ, but it's clear that he doesn't follow him anymore, or that he didn't during that time. I don't know
Hmm.
what the situation is he's in now. Maybe he's repentant now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, who's to say who's saved and who's not saved and stuff
Right.
like
Right.
that. You can obviously say though that he was following the Lord at one point or seemed to be, and then wasn't or didn't anymore, right? Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
Um, what do you
One more
think
thing before we
is?
move on.
Yeah.
On that, I wanted to say, like, I think I want to believe that he started off really well. I want to
Yeah.
believe that he was like a passionate Christian who's like, I'm on fire for the Lord. I got this gift of teaching. I want to do this. And this old sin thing came back to his life, right? And the thing about what like the Bible says, do not promote a new convert too soon, or else
Mhm.
pride will rise in them and it'll destroy them in a sense.
Right.
And so I wonder if that happened where Hillsong realized, oh, this guy who just went through our college, he's amazing. He's really charismatic. He's good looking. Everyone loves him. Let's get him on. Let's push him up. He'll help
Right.
our popularity grow. And I wonder if they promoted him too soon and he didn't have proven character and all this happened. And that just makes me think like, oh man, like me and you, we're young guys who are passionate about ministry. And
Mhm.
like, I don't like, what if we're not any different than how Carl Lentz started off?
Yeah.
You know,
And
and
we
like
definitely
to
could end up in the same situations. It's not
exactly,
hard to get there.
and to like no one should look at these guys and say I would never do that. You know, what's that church
Right.
father quote that you shared with me a while ago about like if you look at the worst of sinners and think you'll never be like them, be afraid because you're one step away from that or
Oh
something.
yeah. I
It's
forget
like
who it was, but yeah, that's a good one.
yeah, it's like we just can never live with this idea like, oh, I'm so above that. I'm above that. It's like, are you like
Yeah.
if you were 20 something, maybe early 30s, and you were given millions of dollars and every celebrity wanted to hang out with you and you were like
Yeah.
in the ministry and you didn't have a lot of accountability,
Yep.
would you
Mhm.
would you stay like we don't know. That's why it's so important that we allow time to test our character and allow God to work on our character before he gives us a place of authority that's
Mm.
really
Mm.
valuable.
Yeah, definitely. So when we're talking about the structure of the church and the things that were wrong within the actual church, I think there's two things that I kind of noticed throughout uh, this documentary. One, there was a lot of surprising fundamentalism that was
Yeah.
in there, which I was so surprised about because it's like at least among the charismatics that I know, it's very progressive within their
Yeah.
theology, especially when it comes to purity things and grace. And so it was so strange to hear about all the purity culture stuff that was in there and all the shaming of people messing up sexually and things like that. It's just so backwards in my mind
Hmm.
for what I'm used to. Um, and I think that could be it could be that like when a leader is struggling with the same thing, they treat that sin harsher among their congregants, which maybe is why like Carl Lentz, maybe that was his biggest struggle. And so maybe that's why he talked about purity so much and like had these strict rules and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what, you see the culture that they were displaying within how they talked about sex and how they talked about leadership and all that kind of stuff was very controlling, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the two problems I see are the structure of the church and then the cultures of control that are like established within the church, because those controlling structures are the things that breed a lot of the abuse in the first place and show a lot of the character of the pastors that are running the whole show, right? And then beyond that is the structure of the church, how big you let things go and how much of an organization you come versus how much of a church you are. I think that's like kind of the last thing we can talk about on the subject too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude. I was also surprised. I was like, I think you hit the nail on the head, at least in my opinion, when you said that it seems like he like harped on it so much, probably because he struggled with it so much. Like that makes so much sense, you know. Like he probably felt like subconsciously it was probably like, I need to hear this message, so I'm gonna preach it. If I preach it to myself, maybe I'll change.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, dude, if you would just reach out for help, if you just talk to someone and say, someone who's not your boss, someone who's not part of anything that you do, you know, find someone who's like not emotionally connected to you at all, but is spiritually mature and say, hey, I'm struggling with this, I need help. Oh my gosh, you could have avoided it so much and grown so much, you know. And I thought the weirdest thing was that like, how much like when he was at Wave Church and he was a young adults pastor, and that one woman said like she was on the worship team, she's like, hey, me and my boyfriend slept together, and he's like, okay, you're off the worship team for 6 months, you're not serving either. That one, okay, first off, I think there's definitely needs to be church discipline when there's sin in leadership. That's not a problem for me. That's biblical. We see that. Now, I think maybe he should have brought it to the elders. They should talk about it, prayed about it, worked with them. But the first thing they should have said was, like, because they asked, this is for anyone who didn't watch it. They said, hey, did you use protection? They're like, yes, we did. It's like, okay, so it was premeditated. That's not appropriate. Why don't you say, hey, you're forgiven.
Right.
Like, God forgives you.
Right.
We forgive you as your leadership, as your church, as your family, we forgive you. However, we still need to keep you, like, there has to be some fallout and consequence because biblically this is not okay.
Yeah.
And for your grace, you know, punishment or discipline from God is never because you're bad, you have to deal with it. It's always, hey, I'm going to discipline you because I love you. That's Hebrews 12. You know, he disciplines those whom he loves. And for our benefit that we're...
And I want you to change.
Right. It's like, hey, like if I let you keep doing this, you're never going to grow. There has to be it's God's grace that discipline is put in place so we can grow spiritually, but it has to be done right. So I don't think that's a problem to have consequences. What was weird is when they said that they made them break up. I'm like, whoa, that is weird authority overreach. Like,
control,
what?
right?
Yeah, that's like,
that's very culty.
I think I would laugh at someone if they did that to me. Like, if they're like, I don't know, if I was in a situation like, you guys got to break up, I'm like, the only thing getting broken up is like me going to this church.
Me going to this church. That's the only thing getting broken up.
I'm leaving. I'm going to go to the chill people over there. They're nice, you know? And so definitely like, And then what were the last things you were talking about right after that?
The church structure and like the things that prop them up for abuse and how much of an organization a church needs to be. This is kind of the theoretical thing I want to talk about at the end.
Okay. Yeah.
Is like how theoretically, how much should a church be a business and how much should it be like a community in a church, right? I think that answer changes based off of how many people you have at a church.
Well, it's also like, I know you want to save it till the end, but we could talk about it right now if you wanted.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Like, it's also kind of like, well, what is the church supposed to be? What is the church? Because it clearly needs some organizational structure. Like, that's biblical. Like, Paul takes an offering and he like takes it back to Jerusalem. And I'm pretty sure the reason they took it to Jerusalem is so the church in Jerusalem, because they know where all the other churches are, you know? So if they have a collective offering, they could say, oh, hey, the church in Macedonia needs some help. Or, hey, the church over in Philippi needs some help. So we can allocate funds over there. We can help funds over there. So because they were the base of knowledge of all the churches, a lot of churches would take up offering and send it to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem would distribute it from there. I'm pretty sure. So that's clearly some structural stuff, right? And then,
Yeah.
yeah, when it comes to being a business or production versus community, it is
Mhm.
tricky. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I echo what you say at the beginning. Like we couldn't exist as a church in our in the West, at least where we are here, without being a business of some sort, right? Of some sort. You got to be a 501c3 to be tax exempt. You got to pay people, obviously, to work if you have a church that employs people, which most of them do. And then it's all about scaling from that point, right? Like if you're a church of like 7 to 10,000 people, like you're going to have quite a few staff, probably, maybe multiple locations.
And the
And
question there is like, should we even allow church? Should not allow, but is it
yeah,
the wisest thing to have churches get there, or
right.
should
And
churches split a
that's not
lot
even that big of
smaller?
a church, I don't think. Like that's not, I don't even think that's a mega church at that point of like 10,000 people.
I
If
think
you
it
have,
depends on location. 10,000 is
yeah,
definitely a mega church.
you think so? Because
Yeah.
you could have a church of like 3 different locations, and also have like 4 different services be 10,000 people and maybe
Yeah,
be
that would be considered a
borderline.
mega church.
You think
At
so?
least
Okay.
in the Midwest, a mega church is considered like I think 1,500 or more.
Oh wow. Okay. Um, Whenever I think if there's like a few hundred people coming to each service, it adds up pretty fast, especially if you had 3 locations times 4 services and you have 300 people coming to each service, you get the numbers up there pretty fast.
Oh
But
yeah, yeah.
um, um, so I think that all changes based off of the size of the church that you're in. So obviously there has to be some kind of foundation um, of business that you have in there. And then I also think there are means of accountability from a business standpoint you also have to put in there. So there's the structure of how do we deal with financial stuff? And then also how do we deal with accountability with our staff from a business standpoint? I think once those things are taken care of, the problems come into play when you get a lot of people coming, because then you get the problems of fame and you get the problems of you're getting a lot more money now, right? So unless you
Mhm.
like cap how much money someone can make, so there isn't an incentive to like get more people to come all the time because you're going to get paid more, that can be healthy. Because obviously like these guys are making tons of money. Like Carl Lentz is
Mhm.
making tons of money.
Oh, they're
And
millionaires.
yeah. Houston, he's making tons of money, right? So all these people are making lots of money, and that's just going to incentivize them to make more money and bring in
Mhm.
more people and be more trendy or do whatever that's going to do, and that's just going to lead to more sin, right? Because they're obviously giving into that original sin. It's just going
Mhm.
to lead to more and more sin tendencies. Um, so I think just as a church, theoretically, in general, you have to have structures of a business, but I don't think there's necessarily a fine line between that and where it kind of stops, because you kind of got to figure out for the location you're in, what are the laws in the place that you're in, how much of a
Mhm.
business can you be, and how much like safely, like how much accountability can you put in from a family standpoint of like this is a community, this is a church, how are we going to structure this to keep it a community, keep it a church that worships together where everybody can use their giftings and stuff like that, and it's not just a production that we put on like Hillsong very much is, right?
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
I think that's kind of the main question you got to ask yourself. But obviously, we're not going to align with someone that really likes the mega church model because we don't like that very much, right? We're not
Right.
going to align with someone who likes it very much because they're going to say, well, we want the bigger production and we think we can put in boundaries to make sure people don't sin. Sure, you could. But I think that there's obviously more temptation when you get to that level of fame and that level of status and money where you're
Oh
going to be
yeah.
tempted by those things more. Of course, there's still temptations for anybody put in power over other people. So any pastor of any size church of 100 people can obviously is going to feel power and is going to have to come to the Lord in humility and try to get the Lord, like in his own heart or her own heart, is going to have to get the Lord to be the king there and submit
Mhm.
themselves to the Lord's authority so that he can be exalted, right? Just like Christ did. So it's hard in no matter what situation you're in, but I think the smaller the church is, it is a little bit easier because you don't have the problems of fame and money. But
Right.
I don't think it's a one-to-one comparison in general. I think in America, we're really trying to dice out what a healthy church looks like going forward. That's like a
Yeah.
huge topic
Yeah.
among people who don't like church.
Yeah, the last thing you were saying, like in America, we're trying to figure out what a healthy church looks like moving forward. I think that is almost like a cultural cry of like people our age, a little bit older, a little bit younger, of like
Yeah.
people coming in as like, oh my gosh, like us, like we've seen how mega churches hurt people. We understand that. We've seen how like I don't know, the purity culture has hurt people. We don't want that. And so there's this whole new idea of like, and the culture seems like with Christianity, like how do we do this the best and healthiest of our ability, right?
Yeah.
And I would wonder if because I've thought about this a lot, is like, oh yeah, everyone should live on support. If you want to weed out people who are there for money, have them raise their own support and have them live off support to serve the church. The problem with that is biblically the tithes are supposed to go to help people serve the church. So they're
Right.
living on support is them getting paid through the tithes, which is what we have right now, and it has problems. So
Right.
I'm like, ooh, that's problematic. So I wonder, like, is there a way where the tithe could be just for outreach and building cost, and
Mhm.
helping people in the congregation, and then everyone on staff has to raise their own support outside of that, where it's like, and maybe the pastor could
Mhm.
say like, hey, this is what we're going to do. Whatever you guys give for tithes, that will go to building costs. That will be for coffee. That will be for putting on
Mhm.
events for free. But our staff and myself, we're going to be raising support, um,
Yeah.
on our own. And so if you're giving money once a month and one of our staff reaches out to you and says, hey, will you support me, don't be surprised like, well, are you giving money, aren't they? We're As
Mhm.
a staff, we're not going to take a pay from the tithes. We want that to go purely just to helping the community. That might work, and I think in a smaller community could be better,
Mhm. I feel like
because
you would come into the same problems of
you
like the
would.
people that are charismatic are still going to be able to raise more support, are going to be more
Yeah,
abusive,
you
and as they get
and the
more
people are gonna want
popularity,
to give money to them too. Like,
yeah.
someone's gonna want to give money to someone like Carl Lentz more than they're gonna want to give money to the janitor, right? And so that's still a problem where it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe we do put a cap on it. But I
Mhm.
think what happens in real life, and this is like actually how it goes, is that for every congregate member that is legally like an employee, and so they base the pay of the pastor based off, well, how much would a CEO of a company this big make?
Well,
And
really?
so, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's like, I've heard some insider information regarding that. Now, I've never looked
That's
into it
terrible.
myself. Yeah, so if you have 1,000 member church, they're saying, oh, if a business had 1,000 employees, how much would the CEO
Mhm.
make? Maybe 500,000. Let's pay our pastor 500,000.
Yeah.
And so that's where the incentive comes. Like, oh, the more people, the more money.
Right.
And that's where it's probably. So I think having a cap and having like maybe lawyers in place or like a board of directors over there to say, here's the cap, and that's what you're staying at. I think that's a
Mhm.
great idea because that kind of doesn't. It can incentivize people, but not too much.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think I would agree. There's a lot of changes that need to happen, I think, to the church model. No matter what, you run into a lot of problems as soon as your church gets too big for pastors to handle the congregants, where people aren't being discipled anymore. And then you run into pastors getting paid too much and all the problems we've talked about. I think one of the bigger problems you see in the Hillsong documentary is also the reason for a lot of the abuse that happens is that they get so big, you become just a business and you become just
Mm-hmm.
a place where how can we get more and more people to come to this church and how can we get more people to stay here? And then when that happens and you have abuse, you're like, oh, this is bad. Like that we have abuse. We don't like the abuse, but also it's bad because people are going to stop coming and we don't want to get paid less. So now we have an incentive to like get this under the rug and make it go away quietly. Right. And
Yeah,
so that just leads to shutting down victims and not getting people to, like own up to their sins and stuff like that, which just leads to more and more problems, as the documentary showed.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's just it, right? Like if you are putting the brand or the popularity or the PR before people, you've
Yeah,
you've left Jesus.
yeah,
It's like that you like the one woman said, I wonder if Jesus would be there flipping over tables. Absolutely he would.
right.
And like this is just a small point I'll make and then we can move on. One of the things that like just this makes me so angry is that they said they had VIP seating for certain people. Like
Hmm.
you could either pay to get up there, or if you were really statused in society, like a celebrity, there was
Hmm.
VIP seating, so normal people couldn't sit there. And an usher was on there, a previous usher of a church was there, and he was saying how he's like, yeah, one time I unknowingly sat a normal person in the VIP seating, and I got yelled at. He's like, I was a volunteer, I got yelled at by one of
Hmm.
the leaders, like saying like, hey, we do not sit normal people up there. And I'm
Right.
like, this is how I know this is why I don't feel bad, and that's why I don't feel bad about saying this because this is so ungodly and I have the
Hmm.
Bible on my side. So I'm like, look, you've left Jesus because
Hmm.
the Bible says in James chapter 2, do not commit the sin of partiality. And you know what
Right.
example it uses, which I think is almost laughable, but it's so sad?
The exact same example.
Exact same, bro.
Yeah.
Exact same. It's
Yeah.
like, hey, if a rich person walk up and you say, hey, sit here and move the poor person to the back,
Yeah.
don't do that. Like, that's sin.
Sounds familiar.
And I'm like, this is the exact same thing. And I was like, how
Yeah.
did you miss that whole point? How did
Right.
any, and that's the thing, like, how did it get past Carl Lentz? How did it get
Mhm.
past his staff? How did it go through all these levels of leadership in a Christian institution? And no one said, hey guys, the Bible says this. Or maybe there's
Yeah.
some people out there who did say that. Maybe they got fired. I don't know. But it's
Yeah.
like, how does it get to the point where it's like, it goes through so many lines of people
Mhm.
before actually becoming a decision where I'm like, what the heck? Anyways, that's just
The only counter like point I can see to that at all is like, hey, celebrities want to go to church too, and they want to like have a Christian community, but like they can't because they're gonna get mobbed if they go to church, so they need like a special place. And I think, okay, sure, like if you gotta section out places for celebrities so they can go to church and just feel like a normal person, but not get like mobbed by questions or paparazzi the whole time they're there, create a special place for them to like be seated where they can go to church, but don't make it the front row. Like it doesn't have to be the best seat in the house. Like put it in the back somewhere so they can sneak in and not have everybody see them. Because obviously you're putting it in the front because you're videoing the front and you're going to get them on video. They're going to have the best experience. They're going to talk about it. Like those are the best seats. Like put them in the back somewhere. You know what I mean? Where it's darker and they can slip in and out and not be noticed.
I love that. I love that.
They don't want attention.
I love that. And you could also like tell the congregation, hey, don't call it VIP seating. That's just
right. Yeah. Number one, like
don't
showing your hand a little bit.
This location is for people who are way better than all of you. It's just, you know,
these people are very important people. Yeah, VIP.
You guys are not very important, actually.
Yeah.
But you could also say from the front, hey, if you guys are curious about why we have this section over there for the celebrities, it's because they want to go to church, feel normal, not feel like they're popular, they don't want to feel like a celebrity. They want to just come here and worship like one of us. And so we put them in a place where they will have the safety to not feel bombarded and just be able to really enjoy church and community. Now, if we get to the point where we can maturely have them there, if the congregation gets to the point of maturity where it's just LeBron, it's just Chris, it's not Chris Pratt, if we get to the point where it's just people and I think that should be the heart of everyone. The Bible says the Bible says consider everyone as worthy of more honor than yourself, but it also talks about how we're not supposed to treat people better because they're some certain status. And so it's just, I was just like, oh my gosh, there's ways. I like your idea. Keep them in the back where no one can see because that helps them also.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think speaking
let's start
overall,
a church that gets this big and we'll do it right. We won't be corrupted.
Yeah, sure. I think overall there's lots of lessons to be learned from this documentary. I think it was pretty good. There's abusers in it. There's people that are genuinely abused. There's obviously some bias from the makers. They do a good job at some points. They do interview genuine Christians. They interview people who are obviously been hurt, and they interview people who have left the faith because of the hurt as well. They do talk about the church structure. They talk about the abuse of money, the abuse of power, the abuse of just the church structure in general, and ways. They don't really talk about ways they think they can make it better, but that's why we're talking about it. I think it's a good documentary overall. I think in the end, like, what do we do about it? I think people just need to realize like large churches aren't healthy churches ever, and it's not how the church is meant to operate. And you need to understand the business structures and how dangerous they are, how dangerous the power structures are, how dangerous it is to pay people like celebrities. But also people need to also realize that, like, the people going to these churches, like, I think a lot of them are genuinely like good Christians. Like, you're not like a bad Christian or something if you go there. Because I have friends we both have friends who are Christians and have gone to Hillsong churches and love them and stuff. And you're not a sinner if you like listen to Hillsong music. And I think the theology of Hillsong is a different thing we can talk about like a different time. It's just a different episode, right? Because I think they were also unfairly just categorized within the episode too. So that's kind of a story for another time. But there's genuine Christians who go there, but also if you're making a production, you're going to get people that are there for the production, not for Jesus, a lot too. So you're probably going to attract a lot of people who aren't even Christians in the first place, but people who just like the show you're putting on, right?
Right. And some people did talk about that. They said, look, I was young. I wanted community. This is where it was. It was,
Right.
and one thing that was said, which I thought was pretty interesting, was like, um, basically the idea that they don't have to deal with sin young because it wasn't confronted. Like,
Mm.
not from the pulpit. It wasn't probably confronted from the pulpit. I'm sure he did say, he talked about like being pure and you have to do this. I'm sure he talked about not sinning, but, um, like there was never like, so in our church, right, it's like 100 people there. You're not going to really get away with cheating on your wife or going out and getting drunk.
Right.
People are going to know. You're not, it's not going to go under the rug. It's going to be like,
Right.
hey dude, you can't go and get drunk. What's going on? If our pastor was cheating on his wife, we would all know. It would be like, hey dude. And so because it's so big, people come in and collectively sin is uncomfortable to talk about. So it's very easy to not talk about it. And when you have that many people that don't want to talk about it, and a percentage of those people aren't even there to get rid of sin, they're there for the community, it just never gets talked about. It's very nice. It's very easy to hide. It's no wonder like, oh yeah, all this sin was hidden because no one talked about it, because you had such a large amount of people, and a lot of people who probably didn't even care to talk about it. Because one is shameful, or they don't want to feel bad, or they're not even, might not even be Christians. And then it just gets perpetuated where people are saying, oh yeah, people are having sex in the church and they were not married. It's like, how does it happen? It's like, well, the whole nature of the thing is like fractured in a sense. It's like, and this is why, like, in my opinion, I think smaller churches are better for growth of the individual because they can't get away with anything.
Right. Right. And that doesn't mean you have to go to a church with like 50 people. Like you can go to a church with a couple hundred people. It's not a big deal. Like you can still go to not a small church, but as long as the church has like pastors that can actually pastor and people who are actually acting in their gifts, it's not too big that it's just a performance. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think even like small groups or cell groups or house groups, whatever people, the name that the church calls it.
Ohana groups.
Ohana groups for us. Which I want to get involved with when I'm back. I never am in Hawaii for long enough time to actually stay there, because I'm always it's one day I won't move for a year and it won't be COVID. But yeah, it's like when you have those smaller, like even smaller, like the smaller you get, and obviously like you want to choose wise, good people that you feel safe with, of course. But like if you can find a really small group of 10 people or 12 people that you feel really safe with, you can be really vulnerable with, that's where your life is going to change. And now there could be like a small group in a church, so then the church is made up of a bunch of different small groups that all worship together. But it's like, oh, your main priority or your main thing of that week is like, I want to get to these people because these are people that these 10 people I can pour my heart out to. I can have them pray for me. I can talk about my struggles. I have developed over a couple years this idea that like, I will be valued and cared for and like seen and respected and loved and called out when I'm wrong and stuff like that. And that will go a long way, but that happens in smaller groups. Like the bigger it gets, the more comfortable it is to share, because the more fear there is about like being judged, which makes sense. You're like, I don't know these 90 people. I don't want to share my deepest darkies with them. But if I know these 10 people,
Right. Yeah. Very true. Well, is there any other things you want to talk about Hillsong Church?
I know we could talk about the theology, but like you said, that's another conversation for another podcast, because that's a deep thing. But I think I will say on it though, very briefly, one of the things they talked about did touch on what we've talked about a bit, called the dominionism theology. They said that like, oh, Brian Houston wants to build a giant church because he believes that it's his mission and his job to spread the church and make every Christian, every human a convert, so Jesus can come back. And I'm like, oh yeah, that is the way they do it, called dominionism.
Right.
And so we talked about that on previous episodes.
Right.
But yeah, other than that, I think main takeaways as you're leaving this episode and some things for us to think about would be like, one, this is why it's important to pray for leaders and pastors. The Bible has teachings on praying for leaders, like pray for them, because the devil wants to take them out. Two, pray for Carl Lentz. Like he's not irredeemable. I mean, or he's not. Is that right? It's not. He's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. He can still. I want to pray for his salvation. I want to pray for genuine repentance. And maybe he's never a pastor again, but he's going to heaven.
Right.
pray that God, like, I would say pray for Carl Lentz, pray for your leaders, and yeah, pray that God takes out the sheep's and wolf's clothing or the wolf and sheep's clothing that we know will be out there. The Bible says almost every New Testament book warns against wolves and sheep's clothing. So we want to pray that God exposes those. But that doesn't mean everyone you disagree with or everyone you don't like is that.
Right.
But yeah, and then what we can do walking away today, like just continue to be Jesus to people, continue to share the gospel. When people are angry and talk about their church hurt, and they're like, I'm angry because of this, and this proves it. It's like, hey, hear their anger, hear their hurt. I'm sure it's valid, but still love them. Like the gospel doesn't change just because people suck. So
yeah, definitely.
That's all I want to say before we leave.
Nice. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. We had a great time. We really liked this documentary series. You should go watch it too if you want to. We got a lot of cool episodes coming up in the future. We're gonna be back in person in 2 weeks, I believe. We'll have some in-person episodes again, and then Ethan's getting married, so we're gonna have some fun times. You can go check us out everywhere: YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Reels, all those places. We have Patreon if you're interested. We got stickers you can buy if you want, all that kind of stuff. Love you guys. Let us know what kind of episodes you want to hear in the future and what topics you want us to talk about. Cool. Peace out.